Dakota Territory, late October, 1883. The wind already had teeth. It scoured the plains, stripping the last brittle leaves from the cottonwoods and promising a winter of uncompromising brutality. And in this land of hard men doing sensible things, Johan Nielsen was digging a trench. It wasn't a well, nor was it a root cellar. It was a long, shallow scar in the earth running parallel to the north wall of his small sod and timber cabin, a structure barely settled into the prairie. He worked with a quiet, unhurried rhythm. The shovel rose, hesitated at the apex of its swing, and then sliced into the dark soil. His movements were economical, born of a life spent in labor. From the rutted track that served as a road, men on wagons would slow their teams. They would watch him for a moment, a solitary figure working on something that made no sense. They saw a man digging a pointless ditch that started nowhere and went nowhere, a ditch he seemed to be lining with fieldstones, as if building a grave for a giant serpent. They called it Nielsen's Folly. At the trading post, it was a source of grim amusement. Another greenhorn Swede, tough as an ox, but with a head full of strange European notions. He was wasting the last precious days of autumn, time that should have been spent banking his walls with sod or laying in a final cord of wood. Instead, he was playing with rocks and dirt. What did this quiet immigrant, this former foundry worker from the iron heart of Sweden, understand about heat and earth that every seasoned plainsman and carpenter had missed? What secret was he burying in the cold ground, a secret he believed would save his family from the coming White Death? Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because the answer would fundamentally rewrite the rules of survival on the unforgiving frontier. To understand Johan's folly, you first have to understand the enemy. The Dakota winter was not merely cold. It was an active, malevolent force. It was a predator that hunted the unwary and the unprepared. It found every crack in a cabin's chinking, every gap beneath a door. It forced its way inside not as a draft, but as a physical presence. Settlers spoke of it in hushed tones. They told stories of water freezing in the bucket just feet from a roaring fire, of ink turning to black ice in the well, of men waking to find a thick rime of frost on their blankets, their own frozen breath clinging to the wool. The cold was relentless, a siege that lasted for 5 months. The conventional solution was the cast iron stove, a marvel of modern technology. It was the heart of the home, a greedy, roaring god that demanded constant tribute. A family's winter was measured not in days or weeks, but in cords of wood. A settler's life revolved around the monumental task of felling, bucking, splitting, and stacking enough cottonwood and ash to feed the beast. Yet, it was a deeply flawed strategy. The stoves created a small bubble of survivable heat in an ocean of lethal cold. Step 6 feet from the stove, and the temperature would plummet by 20 degrees. The walls of the cabin, no matter how well built, were always cold to the touch. The floor, often packed earth or rough-hewn planks laid directly on the ground, was a perpetual source of frigid air. This was the phenomenon of radiant heat loss. A body, a stove, anything warm, radiates its energy towards anything cold. In a standard cabin, the stove would heat the air, which would rise to the ceiling. But the occupants, the furniture, the very people themselves were constantly losing their own body heat to the freezing walls, the icy floor, and the single-pane glass windows. It was an endless, losing battle against physics. You could be sweating on one side and freezing on the other. Children were kept bundled indoors, often suffering from chilblains and respiratory ailments. Families would burn through their winter wood supply by February, forced to burn fence posts, furniture, or even the very seed corn needed for the spring planting. Survival was possible, but comfort was a distant, almost unimaginable luxury. The winter was a time to be endured, a gray purgatory between harvests. Johan Nielsen had seen this before, not on a prairie, but in the fiery heart of a Swedish ironworks. He was not a carpenter or a farmer by trade. He had spent 15 years of his life tending the great furnaces, learning the language of fire, stone, and metal. He understood things that other men, practical men, had no reason to know. He knew that a brick oven, once heated, would stay warm for 2 days, baking bread with its retained energy long after the fire was out. He knew that the massive stone foundations of the furnaces were warm to the touch even in the deepest winter, leaking heat slowly and steadily. He understood the concept of thermal mass, the ability of a dense material to absorb, store, and then slowly radiate heat. When he looked at a Dakota cabin, he didn't see a shelter. He saw a thermodynamic failure. He saw a system that poured immense energy into heating the air, a notoriously poor retainer of heat, while completely ignoring the single largest thermal battery available, the Earth itself. The ground beneath their feet, cold and unforgiving, could be their greatest ally. If only it could be taught to hold the warmth. That was the core of his strange idea. That was the purpose of the trench. The construction of Nielsen's Folly began with that trench. It was 3 feet deep, 2 feet wide, and stretched 12 feet along the north face of his cabin. He lined the bottom and sides with the flattest field stones he could find, mortaring them with a thick slurry of clay and prairie grass. He was building a long stone box in the earth. Next came the most peculiar part. From the settlement, he had salvaged dozens of rusted, discarded sections of stovepipe. They were dented and imperfect, useless for a conventional chimney. But for Johan, they were perfect. He laid them in the bottom of the stone-lined trench, end to end, creating a long, crude metal duct. At one end of the trench, he built a deep stone-lined firebox with a heavy iron grate at the bottom and a short, stout chimney at the top. At the other end, the stovepipe turned 90 degrees and disappeared through a carefully sealed opening in his cabin's foundation. Silas Croft came to watch one afternoon. Croft was the closest thing the territory had to a master builder. He had framed every church and saloon for 50 miles. His cabins were known for their tight joints and sturdy roofs. He was a respected man, and his opinion carried the weight of seasoned timber. He stood with his arms crossed, watching Johan meticulously packing clay around the stovepipes. "Nielsen," Croft said, his voice not unkind, but heavy with authority. "What are you aiming to do here?" Johan wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a dirt-caked hand. "Making a heater for the floor." Croft squinted, trying to understand the mechanics of the thing. He saw a firebox, a buried pipe, and an opening into the cabin. He shook his head slowly. "That thin metal will condense moisture from the ground like you wouldn't believe. It'll be a rusty sieve before the first thaw." Johan nodded, acknowledging the point. "Is why I pack clay. Keep it dry." Croft gestured to the firebox. "You light a fire in there, and the prevailing wind is going to push smoke right back through that pipe and into your house." You'll smoke your wife and children out like raccoons in a den. It was a sound, logical objection based on decades of experience with chimneys and drafts. Johann simply pointed to the short chimney stack on the firebox. Smoke goes up, hot air wants to go up, but I will pull it. Croft remained unconvinced. Even if you get it to work, the ground will just suck the heat away. It's a losing game, man. The earth is a cold heart. You can't warm it with a little fire. He clapped Johann on the shoulder, a gesture of sincere, if condescending, advice. Bank your walls, son. Spend your time on what's proven. Johann gave a small, polite smile. I'm just trying to keep my family warm. The exchange was repeated, in cruder forms, all over the settlement. The mockery grew louder. The name Nilsson's Folly stuck. It became a byword for pointless, backbreaking labor. Men would joke about going out to warm the prairie when they saw him working. He was building a monument to his own foolishness. Inside the cabin, the work was just as strange. The stovepipe that entered through the foundation didn't just stop. It snaked back and forth under the entire floor area in a serpentine pattern, laid in carefully dug channels. He supported the pipes on small stones, ensuring they were surrounded by an air gap. He had effectively created a radiator beneath his floor. Then he began to build the floor itself. It was not wood. It was a painstaking composition of materials. First, a 6-inch layer of dry sand, hauled from the riverbank. Then, a layer of larger, flat stones, fitted together like a puzzle. Finally, he topped it all with a 4-inch layer of the same dense clay he used outside, mixed with straw and a little lime. He and his wife, Anna, packed it down by hand, then smoothed it with wet boards until it was as flat and hard as a threshing floor. The final piece of the puzzle was inside. The serpentine pipe system terminated not in an open vent, but at the base of their small, conventional wood stove. He had ingeniously disconnected the stove's own air intake and connected the underfloor pipe to it instead. Now, the complete system could be understood. It was not just a heater, it was an engine, a lung. When he lit a fire in the outside trench, the smoke and exhaust would rise up its short chimney. But the real magic was in the ductwork. The fire in the inside stove would begin to draw air for its own combustion. Its draft would pull air from the only available source, the pipe connected to its base. This pull created a powerful, steady suction. It would draw the superheated air and hot gases from the external firebox, pulling them into the long stovepipe running the length of the trench. This air, hot enough to make the pipe glow cherry red, would then be pulled into the serpentine ductwork under the floor. It would race through the channels, transferring its immense heat to the sand, the stones, and the thick clay above it. By the time the air reached the indoor stove to be used for combustion, it had given up most of its heat to the floor. It was pre-warmed intake air, making the stove itself burn hotter and more efficiently. The smoke and gases from the outside fire never entered the cabin. They were consumed by the inside fire. Silas Croft's logical objection about smoke was defeated. His concern about rust was addressed by the clay packing. And his fundamental misunderstanding of thermal mass was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Johann had built a giant, slow-release battery. He would burn a hot, fast fire in the outside trench for 2 hours every evening, using scrap wood, brush, even dried buffalo chips. This would charge the thermal mass of his floor. The floor would then gently, silently, radiate that stored heat upwards into the cabin all night long and well into the next day. He wasn't just heating the air, he was heating the house itself. Then December came. The sky turned the color of lead, and the wind fell silent. An unnatural stillness settled over the prairie. The old-timers knew the sign. This was not a storm. This was a reckoning. The first flakes were small and dry, skittering across the frozen ground. Within an hour, the world had disappeared into a churning vortex of white. The temperature at dawn had been 10 degrees above zero. By sunset, it was 10 below. By the next morning, the thermometer at the trading post, a sturdy mercury instrument, had frozen solid at its lowest marking, -40 degrees Fahrenheit. This was the blizzard that would be spoken of for generations. It was a storm that erased roads, buried livestock where they stood, and laid siege to every home on the prairie. It was the ultimate impartial test of every theory of survival. Inside the conventional cabins, the fight for life began. The cold was a physical beast, clawing its way through the walls. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Families huddled around their stoves, feeding them a constant stream of precious hardwood. The iron glowed red, yet 6 feet away, water would freeze. The heat went straight up to the ceiling, while a river of Arctic air flowed across the floor. They stuffed rags into the cracks around doors and windows, but it was useless. A fine, glittering dust of snow was driven through the smallest openings, coating everything. They burned through a week's worth of wood in a single day. Then they started on the fence posts, then the spare chairs. The terror was not just the cold, it was the arithmetic of a dwindling woodpile. In Silas Croft's cabin, the one he had built with his own hands, the one he knew was the tightest and best made in the county, the battle was being lost. He had a large, efficient stove and a mountain of seasoned oak, but the cold was overwhelming. A thick layer of frost, like a coat of white paint, crept up the inside of the north wall, growing thicker by the hour. His wife and 2 children were bundled in every blanket they owned, their faces pinched and blue in the flickering firelight. Silas worked like a man possessed, constantly feeding the stove, his knuckles raw from the wood. He could feel the house groaning under the pressure of the wind. He was doing everything right. He was following every rule of proven, sensible construction. And it was not enough. On the 3rd day of the storm, a new fear began to gnaw at him, a fear colder than the wind. He thought of the Swede. He thought of Johan Nielsen and his family, in their small cabin with its foolish dirt floor. He imagined them frozen, huddled together, their fire long since extinguished, victims of one man's stubborn pride. A grim sense of responsibility settled over him. He had watched the man build his folly. He had warned him. But he had not insisted. He had not forced the man to listen to reason. And now, a family might be dead because of it. Stay with me, because what Silas Croft was about to witness would not only shatter his understanding of the world, but would change the way men lived in this harsh land forever. He had to go. He had to know. Pulling on his heaviest buffalo coat and wrapping his face in wool until only his eyes were visible, he plunged into the white fury. The journey was less than half a mile, but it was a battle for every foot. The wind tore at him, a solid wall of force and ice. The snow was waist deep, and he could see no more than 10 feet in any direction. He navigated by instinct, keeping the memory of a lone cottonwood as his guide. He stumbled, fell, and rose again, his beard freezing solid to the wool scarf. The cold was a physical pain, a crushing weight on his chest. It was a world without color, without sound, save for the screaming of the wind. When the dark shape of Nilsson's cabin finally emerged from the swirling snow, he nearly wept with relief and dread. There was no smoke coming from the main chimney. His heart sank. It was as he feared. They had run out of wood, or the fire had gone out, and they had frozen. He saw a thin, almost invisible plume of heat haze rising from the short stack on the trench, but in his panicked state, it barely registered. He hammered on the door with a frozen fist, shouting Nilsson's name against the wind. The door swung inward, and Silas Croft was hit by a physical force. It was not a sound or a sight. It was a wave of heat, a dense, enveloping, impossible wave of warm, still air. It was like stepping from the Arctic into a summer kitchen. He stood there, blinking, his mind refusing to process the scene before him. The air smelled of baking bread and warm earth. Johan Nilsson stood before him, not in a heavy coat, but in his shirt sleeves, his face calm. In the center of the room, on the smooth clay floor, his two small children were playing. They were barefoot. Silas's gaze swept the cabin, desperately seeking an explanation. There was no roaring fire. The small stove in the corner glowed with a gentle, steady heat. Its damper turned almost completely shut. There was no frost on the single-pane window, none. He could see the swirling vortex of the blizzard outside, as if through a clear pane of glass in July. He looked at the walls, the north wall, the one that should have been a sheet of ice. It was bare. It was dry. He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut against the storm. He unwrapped the frozen scarf from his face, his movements clumsy and slow. He was in a state of profound shock. Anna, Johan's wife, offered him a cup of coffee, her expression one of simple hospitality, as if it were a perfectly normal day. Silas, the master builder, the expert, began to investigate. He was no longer a neighbor checking on a friend. He was a scientist witnessing a miracle and trying to deconstruct it. He walked to the north wall and pressed his bare palm against it. It was not just not cold, it was warm. He pressed his hand to the wall and felt a distinct, gentle warmth radiating into his skin. He had never felt such a thing in his life. He then knelt, his knees cracking in the cold, and placed his hand flat on the floor. The clay was warm, not hot, not uncomfortable, but deeply, fundamentally warm. The source of the heat was not the stove, it was the house itself. The entire floor was a single, massive, low-temperature radiator. He looked at the woodbox next to the stove. It was nearly full. This, more than anything, broke his understanding of the world. In his own home, he was burning wood at a frantic, unsustainable rate. Here, they seemed to be barely using any. "How much wood?" Silas asked, his voice raspy, almost a whisper. "How much have you burned since the storm started?" Johan considered the question. "For the inside stove, maybe a quarter of a cord. For the trench, I burn mostly brush, 2 hours in the evening." The numbers were a physical blow, a quarter of a cord. Silas had burned through more than a full cord in the same amount of time, and his house was still an icebox. The Nielsen cabin was maintaining a temperature he estimated at nearly 70 degrees in the face of a 60-mile-an-hour wind and a temperature of 40 below zero on a fraction of the fuel. The efficiency was not just better, it was an order of magnitude beyond anything he had ever thought possible. The numbers were undeniable. He walked back to the floor, running his hands over its smooth, warm surface. He finally understood. The heat wasn't escaping through the floor. It was coming from the floor. The ground was not his enemy. It was his reservoir. Johann hadn't just built a cabin. He had built a system. He had tamed the earth itself. Silas Croft looked at Johann Nielsen, this quiet Swede he had pitied. This man whose foolishness had been a source of amusement for the entire settlement. He saw no pride in the man's eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." He saw only a calm, simple competence. He stood up, the full weight of his own arrogance crashing down on him. He had been so certain in his knowledge, so dismissive of what he did not understand. He had trusted tradition over innovation, and his family was freezing because of it. "Johann," Silas said, and his voice was thick with emotion. He met the other man's eyes. "I was wrong, completely wrong." He swept a hand around the impossibly warm room. This is genius. You have to teach me. You have to teach me how this works." When the great blizzard finally broke after 4 days, the world was remade. The prairie was a vast, sculptural expanse of white. The silence was absolute. From the chimneys of the settlement, thin plumes of smoke began to rise again, tentative signs of life. The stories that emerged were of hardship, loss, and near disaster. Livestock was lost by the hundreds. Several families had been forced to burn their furniture to survive. One homesteader, caught out on the prairie, was found frozen solid. But another story began to circulate, a story told first by Silas Croft. He told it at the trading post, his voice filled with the fervor of a convert. He described walking into Johann Nielsen's cabin and being met by a wave of summer air. He described the barefoot children, the warm floor, the full wood box. At first, the men were skeptical. They thought the ordeal had affected Croft's mind. But Silas was not a man given to exaggeration. His reputation for sober, practical judgment was unassailable. When he spoke, men listened, and he was now speaking of Nielsen's folly, not as a joke, but as a revolution. He led a small delegation of the settlement's leading men to the Nielsen cabin. They came as doubters. They left as believers. They pressed their hands to the warm clay floor, they checked the meager woodpile, and they felt the profound, even warmth that filled the small space. The proof was tangible. It was irrefutable. The transformation was immediate. Nielsen's folly became the Nielsen floor, or more simply, the Dakota heater. That spring, before the first planting, Silas Croft was not framing a new barn. He was at his own home, with Johann Nielsen at his side, digging a trench along his north wall. He was the first to replicate the design, and with his builder's knowledge, he made small improvements. A better damper system for the firebox, a more robust way of sealing the ductwork. The next autumn, a dozen other families followed suit. Digging the trench and laying the floor became a new seasonal ritual, as important as stacking wood or harvesting corn. Johann Nielsen became an unlikely teacher. He never sought credit or payment. He would simply show up when asked, his shovel in hand, and quietly demonstrate the method. He would explain the importance of the air gap around the pipes, the proper mix for the clay floor, the way to read the draft from the stove. He shared his knowledge freely, as a simple matter of neighborly duty. His reward was not fame or fortune, but the quiet satisfaction of seeing other cabins with clear, frost-free windows during the next winter's cold snaps. The impact on the community was profound. It was measured in cords of wood saved, yes, but the true effect was more human. It was measured in the health of children, who no longer spent the winter huddled in a single cold room. It was measured in the newfound security of families who no longer feared the sound of the winter wind. The house was no longer a fragile shield against the cold. It was an active participant in its own defense. It was a warm, living thing. The real impact wasn't measured in degrees or cords of wood. It was measured in human dignity. It was the ability to walk barefoot in your own home in January. It was the simple luxury of a home that was uniformly warm, a sanctuary not just from the storm, but from the constant, grinding fear of the cold. The story of Johan Nielsen and his warm floor is a powerful reminder of a simple truth. Innovation often comes not from the experts, but from the outsiders, from those with a different perspective, forged in a different fire. The seasoned plainsman saw the ground as a cold, dead thing to be insulated against. The Swedish foundry worker saw it as a massive, untapped battery waiting to be charged. Tradition and conventional wisdom provide a solid foundation, a set of rules that have been proven to work. But when faced with an extreme problem, sometimes the rules need to be broken. The arrogance of dismissing what we do not immediately understand is a trap that has plagued humanity for centuries. True wisdom lies in the humility to accept that our own knowledge has limits and to recognize genius when it appears in an unlikely form. The principles Johan Nielsen applied in his crude, hand-dug system are the very same ones used today in advanced engineering. His warm clay floor was a forerunner of modern radiant floor heating. His use of the earth as a heat sink and radiator is a core concept in geothermal energy and passive solar design. He had, with fieldstone, scrap metal, and prairie clay, created a highly efficient thermal mass storage system. So the next time you see a solution that looks foolish or counterintuitive, remember the story of Nielsen's folly. Hit that like button if this story changed how you think about looking at a problem, and subscribe for more forgotten wisdom from the frontiers of human ingenuity. What is the coldest winter you have ever faced? Let us know in the comments below. The narrative presented here is a fictionalized account inspired by historical principles of thermal mass heating and hypocaust systems, which have been used in various forms for centuries. The characters, specific events, and location are composite creations for storytelling purposes. The engineering concepts are based on real-world physics, but this content is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice.